All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from today. I wanted to welcome everyone to MIT Professional Education Digital Plus Program webinar, Creating Successful Digital Platforms from APIs to Feature Roadmaps. In this session today, we're going to cover all the keys of creating and fostering successful digital platforms. So my name is Liz Coffey, and I'll be the moderator of the webinar. I just want to thank everyone so much for joining us today. We're very happy to have you here for what will no doubt be a very interesting session. I'd like to quickly go through some logistical information before we get started. We encourage everyone to keep your cameras turned on if you feel comfortable doing so. We love to see your faces. On the other hand, we kindly ask you to keep your microphones muted throughout the session so that we can give our full attention. The session will be given in English. However, we do have simultaneous interpretation into Spanish. So if you prefer to listen in Spanish, you may switch now to the Spanish channel. There's a button at the bottom of your screen that's called interpretation. So you can click that to switch audio channels. Esta transmisión se hará en inglés, aunque realizaremos el doblaje al español en simultáneo. Si prefieres cambiar el idioma a español, puedes hacerlo ahora y seleccionar la opción interpretación y haz clic en español. And if you have questions, we welcome them. So please feel free to send them in both English and Spanish in the chat. We will have a Q&A part of the session, and we hope to answer any questions that you're sending. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Bruce Cameron and Professor Olivier de Weck, and they will be leading the session today. And Dr. Bruce Cameron is the director of the System Architecture Group at MIT. His research interests include technology strategy, system architecture, and the adoption of industry platforms. Dr. Cameron has directed research projects for Amazon, Chevron, Sikorsky, Nokia, Caterpillar, and NASA. He is also co-founder of Technology Strategy Partners, a consultancy group, and has been an advisor at 12 early stage firms across consumer and online platforms. And so Dr. Cameron and Professor de Weck are going to be leading the MIT Professional Education Digital Plus program called Digital Platforms, Designing Two-Sided Markets from APIs to Feature Roadmaps, which launches February 28th in English and April 26th in Spanish. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand the microphone over to Dr. Cameron. And thanks again for being here with us today. We hope you enjoy the session.
All right, welcome to all of you. We're really psyched to see so many of you here. I see over 300 people joining us. Hello from Brazil, hello from Denmark. My colleague Olivier de Weck is also here. Ollie, do you want to introduce yourself briefly as well?
Yeah, I think we have a chart on that a little bit later, but it's a pleasure to be here, Bruce, Liz, and everyone from around the world. It's really fantastic to have this global audience. We're very excited about this new offering. This is really a course that we can say was created based on demand, on what we heard from you. So Bruce, back to you, and I'll chime in as we go along.
Great. Well, let me say this topic is certainly trendy today. There's a tremendous amount of interest and capital flowing into businesses that are some form of platform. So I put 4 on the screen here, and other than being very well recognized brand names, we can ask the question sort of what do these share? What's the common DNA behind these? Each of these has been incredibly successful in their own right. If you're not familiar, Etsy is essentially the eBay of craft goods, an online marketplace that connects people who produce unique items with people who want to buy those unique items. I think we're all familiar with LinkedIn as the great network. Can I say it that way? The business whose business is networking. DoorDash, I think many are familiar with, although those of you outside the US may be less familiar with this. DoorDash is a delivery service that competes against Uber Eats and several other delivery services doing both food delivery as well as other types of delivery. And then Salesforce, these are quite disparate companies I brought here. I think many of you know Salesforce as a sort of organizer of the sales process and the lead gen pipeline. Question is, what links these four? In fact, all four of these are two-sided markets. And that's really the sort of meat of this class that we want to talk about. How do people really organize these two-sided markets? LinkedIn has seen tremendous success as job seekers put their profiles up and job offers go looking to LinkedIn to find who's available. It has really taken off. The two sides have sort of fed on each other in much the same way that Etsy has taken off, as people offering craft goods have found an audience and a buying population. So the big idea of this course is to look at what does it take to deploy a two-sided market. That's perhaps best articulated on this chart. What we are looking at designing in the context of this course is the middle piece, and asking the question of what are the technical puzzle pieces that I have to bring together, and what are the relevant market considerations that I should examine to think about, could this be an attractive business for me? I think there's a tremendous number of people who've talked about, wouldn't it be great if we became the Uber of this business, or if we had the App Store? And yet, a relatively small fraction of those succeed. And so what we were really interested to sort of dig into in this class is not just to talk about, isn't it wonderful to have growth, but to go behind the scenes and ask the question of sort of what architecture supports that growth? How does that architecture enable the scale that we're looking to build? How do our users prioritize what features are of interest to them? And to what extent could we plan that out as a way to sort of enable this type of business model? The investment side of this is quite clear, right? The investment community has been really intrigued by these companies, because on the one hand, their growth, once it takes off, can be very, very nonlinear. And on the other hand, it would seem that these companies seem to capture whole markets. Much the way that we don't really talk about competitors to LinkedIn anymore, right? There are certainly competitors, and LinkedIn plays in a couple of different markets, but they have a very dominant market share, and it's difficult to dislodge them. From an investment perspective, that's very attractive. So there would seem to be a bunch of upside to this, but I also think that there are downsides to this, and sort of balancing those two is really, I think, an interesting question to get into for this course. So this is some recent research done by colleagues of ours at MIT, at Harvard, and in the UK, who looked at a sample of industry platform companies and asked the question of how many of them are successful. And what they found was actually a relatively small number of them really take off and succeed. In their study, some 20% or so were successful and 80% were not. And the average lifetime was about 5 years for the unsuccessful ventures. So, I think there's a lot of popular press looking at sort of how these social networks and how these network-driven businesses take off and gain share. But in this course, we really want to talk about what are all the things that happen behind the scenes to make sure that you're in the 80% camp, or sorry, that you're in the 20% camp and not in the 80% camp. So that's sort of the big intro for the course. I'll give you a little bit more about my background. I'll ask my colleague, Professor Dweck, to also introduce himself. And then what we intend to do for this time is to talk you through what we intend to cover in this course and to take your questions on it. I'll be interested to hear how this relates to the work that you guys are doing or that you want to do in the future. So just by background, I am particularly interested in this question of architecture. What are the technical choices that we make behind the scenes that enable scale. We have done this across a number of different industries and done a series of case studies and research projects around this that are present in the course. One of the bigger ones was on drivers of loyalty between Uber and Lyft. What are the fraction of people that check Uber or that check Lyft or that check both of them, and what causes that behavior is really, I think, an interesting and central question for this course. So it's my privilege to teach both in the School of Engineering at MIT as well as in the business school. And you will see that that's blended between the offering that you guys are contemplating here in this course, that there's a number of dimensions to these industry platform companies that are very much business questions. How do we price this service? What is the relative attractiveness in different markets, et cetera? But then the heart of the course is, how do we build these? And that, for me, is a technical discussion as well. So that's a little bit about my background. Professor Dweck, would you introduce yourself as well?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Bruce. So my name is Olivier Devec. I'm a professor. I'm a colleague of Bruce Cameron's here at MIT. I'm originally from Switzerland. I've been on the faculty here for about 20 years. And my primary interest is in system design and evolution over time. So I've studied systems, how they're not just designed in the beginning, but how do they grow, mature, maybe decline, and also how technologies are infused in complex systems. One class of those systems, of course, is platforms. And we have, over the years, and that's in part how we got to know each other, offered a course on physical platforms together, product platforms. You're all familiar, for example, with the automotive industry, where a platform, Volkswagen, for example, is a company that has done this very well historically. So from one platform, you're offering many different models. What's happened really over the years is that many of these, what the meaning of a platform is much more general today. And with digital transformation in society, in this course, we are transcending the physical platforms into the virtual world. And another really interesting thing that you will see laid out in the modules is not just the problem of creating or initiating one of these platforms, but then nurturing it, growing it, preventing it from decaying prematurely through both design decisions, but also managerial decisions that you can make as your platform evolves, as your competitors become clear. And there's even somewhat of a game theoretic aspect to this. I also like to work on real world applications. So one of the cases I'll be discussing a little bit later is work we've done with Google on the Aura project. So back to you, Bruce. Thank you.
All right. So, I think the question at the heart of this is, why do some of these firms succeed and not others, right? What was it about Netflix that caused their success? Or said otherwise, why was it that Blockbuster never got into the content business? Blockbuster, for those of you not in the US, was a very prominent video store rental chain that had a dominant market share in the US and died a fiery death some 10 years ago when Netflix came online. I think we could similarly look at Apple and Nokia as a pairing there. The world's most prominent technology company, was at one point a disruptor to Nokia, who had a leading market share, who had the most common and also the greatest technology available in terms of their phones. What was it that really sort of propelled Apple ahead in the smartphone market ahead of Nokia? This question in each of these cases is all about what creativity did these firms open themselves up to? What did they give away in terms of their right to operate, to attract a series of partners. And this is a really, I think this is such a fascinating area because it's so hard to give away that control. I think in the Uber case, perhaps that's a little more evident, right? Uber is staked a position about the drivers are independent contractors versus our employees. And in that case, the giveaway is sort of more obvious as to its benefits. But I think for a lot of innovation-driven companies, it's a hard question to ask. Why would we expose some of our data to potential partners and also potentially to the competition to take a look at? What's the upside that's associated with that? So this, this framing of sort of one company's success versus another company is a great way to go back and look at this. And in fact, in the, what we've done in the course is sort of produce a series of case studies to go back and look at what has caused some of these players to be successful where others weren't. So a brief sort of overview of the program that we've put together here is roughly 8 weeks. And in this journey, we want to lead you through what are the basics, what really is an industry platform and what is not an industry platform. This word platform is so broad as to almost mean nothing in some industries. If I built an OS, is that a platform? If I built some background IT work infrastructure, is that a platform? Here we're going to be talking about platform companies like Netflix, like Uber, like others. But what constitutes a platform? What are the ingredients that we need for them? The second week of the course is focused on what does it take to build a successful ecosystem? And we structure a series of questions around what successful ecosystems have looked like, and then ask you to analyze other firms for their relative merits. One of the sort of design philosophies that we had in going into this is we want you guys to be challenging the work on new case studies. And so every week has a project where we're either asking you to look back at historical case and analyze it, or whether in fact we're asking you to look forward and to build a plan for creating an industry platform. So in week 2, we're asking you to do that retrospective analysis, and in week 3, we start asking you to think about what would it take to initiate and to build some vision around an industry platform. So week 3 is very focused on the overall vision for the market. What are the two sides? How do you price to the two sides? What's your intent to essentially woo one of the sides to kickstart this positive feedback loop by either bringing in a series of eyeballs on the consumer side or bringing in a series of partners to attract a set of consumers? What does that look like? And then the course really sort of starts to have the rubber hit the road in week 4. And week 4 and 5 are really the sort of technical beating heart of this question. What do we actually need to build behind the scenes? What we call them in the course are technical puzzle pieces. Are we going to have a matching engine that lives at the heart of this that allows me to sort of grab buyers and sellers and pair them up? Do we have a search algorithm? Do we have a filter set? Do we have a route planning algorithm? Do we have a transaction platform? What are the different pieces that we have to bring together on the back end in order to make one of these work? And through that, we'll lead you through the process of thinking about this as a hierarchy of services. What are the services we need to offer and how do they need to play together, and sort of plan that out with you. Then we'll also take a look at what are some prominent industry standards that people have deployed and how people used industry standards in order to structure the architecture that they deploy. So based on that sort of initial vision and then technical implementation, week 5, module 5 here is a question of how we think about ensuring the quality over time. Conditional on this sort of taking off, there's a big question about sort of how we make sure that people are seeing the same quality over time. I think eBay really went through a series of challenges with that, where there was a whole period there where people talked about Fleabay, right? That the number of partners that were offering products on eBay were not really well organized according to reviews, and were not being sorted out. And there were a lot of people who had bad experiences after eBay initially took off, because there was insufficient sort of quality controls or sort of negative feedback loops around reviews to make that sort of system work. So in week 5, we'll talk about what are the ways in which we can think about monitoring that, think about encouraging that, think about steering that, through some of them through the APIs that we offer, some of them through the choice of platform infrastructure that we offer, and then some of them through a governance process. What vetting do we do on new app developers or new partners that want to join this system? Module 6 is then a discussion of what are the users and partners as a competitive landscape. So coming sort of out of this initial vision and this initial prototype and the sort of early stage of this, if you were Lyft today, how would you choose to compete against Uber? And what are the strategies that other firms have used to compete in this market? We want to talk about how do you build an ecosystem that offers some barriers to entry or that offers some protections, and how do you think about driving customer loyalty as the platform grows over time. Week 7 is then a forward-going look at the research. What's going on in the community that we understand and that's actively being worked on. We'll show you what people have done to try and model these two-sided platforms, and we'll take a look at what the current slate of work is, where people are trying to understand what makes these platforms tick. And then week 8 is a final project that we will lead you through in a recap of the course. So that's the sort of vision for the course. Professor Devek, any comments from your perspective?
No, I think this is an excellent summary. We are also touching on one aspect in the course is let's say you are successful and your platform is growing and you are doing the quality control well, all the things that Bruce, you mentioned. If your platform reaches a certain critical size, it will get the attention not only of your competitors, but it will also get the attention of regulators and governments typically. And so when a platform is small, growing, and it doesn't have big market share, that is typically not a big issue. But when your platform reaches a critical size, it will become visible and subject to different regulatory actions potentially. And this is something that we are also covering in the course with some examples to raise, the awareness of this important issue, because the commercial world enabled by digital platforms and society and the regulatory world then start to interact in complex ways that can influence the evolution of those digital platforms. That was the only thing I would add here.
Yeah, it's there's no shortage of challenges for this. I think there's so much popular press about wouldn't it be great to experience this kind of exponential growth? But as Professor Devek's pointing out, there are challenges that come with growth, and from our perspective, there are also very real challenges to technically orchestrating this. The tech stack to build one of these might feel like a sort of minimum viable product that we just have to launch a web page and have the offerings up on the web page, and providers will be able to put their offerings into that web page. But I think the reality for the firms that have done this successfully is there's a very careful ballet going on behind the scenes, trying to make sure that the two sides of the market stay in sync and have the technical means to stay in sync. So what I'd like to do is talk you through just a little bit of our philosophy about how we built this course. If this is the content, what you'll actually live through the course is not watching a series of long lectures from MIT, and it's also not, reading a textbook on this. We've structured this course to work you through this in such a way that you have lots of opportunities to try it out in different areas, and also get to see a lot of case studies. So as we sort of hop through these various weeks, I want to sort of just point out some of the areas that we've sort of added to the course in. So in each of the weeks, there's a series of industry guest lectures that we brought in to speak to sort of what are the challenges that they faced. These guest speakers, I think, represent the reality of the challenges of building out these two-sided markets. And we have them here in week one to speak to the initial sort of framing of, how do we think about network effects at LinkedIn, right? What is the incremental benefit to every existing user of LinkedIn when a new user of LinkedIn joins? And I'll just sort of highlight some of those other sort of pieces as we go through the 8 weeks of the course. In week two, which is a sort of case studies on successful ecosystems, we have a guest speaker from Uber Eats, who was there on the ground floor of early days, launching Uber Eats into new markets, trying to convince restaurant owners to sign up to Uber Eats, trying to photograph food, trying to generate interest on the restaurant side, as well as trying to generate interest on the driver side, the second side of the market, as well as trying to advertise services to consumers. Uber Eats is a sort of three-sided market. It's in fact more complex than just Uber's driver and rider model, because you have a set of food providers that are also in the mix there. So we have a speaker who looks at her journey in doing that at Uber as part of week two, looking at what a successful ecosystem looks like. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also a project here asking you to analyze a past system. When we talk about initiation and first transactions, we have a guest speaker from Etsy, who speaks about what are the set of decisions that Etsy made to help sort of foster a community. Etsy is very well known for having a supportive seller environment. There's a huge set of forums on Etsy, which are functionally a source of lock-in for Etsy. It's a beautiful thing to have if you can generate it, such that the sellers help each other sell more on Etsy. And how did Etsy set that up is part of the question that we ask in module 3, initiation of first transactions. As we get into the sort of more technical details from a module 4 perspective, we have a guest speaker from BlaBlaCar, which is essentially the French Uber, but it's a little more complex. It's the French Uber for long distance journeys rather than for short distance journeys. Who talks about some of the architectural decisions that BlaBlaCar made early on in the setup, and furthermore, how they are conducting essentially A/B tests as they now move into different markets. What are the opportunities to examine that feature set as offered when you enter Poland as a new market, or when you enter Italy as a new market? You could offer the same service, or you could make some permutations and run some tests with that. Very common idea in the software world that we're going to live in the context of this course. That's also sort of applicable as we think about international expansion for these businesses. When by the time we get to module 5, you've been exposed to a number of different guest speakers. One of the guest speakers we include in module 5 is from DoorDash, looking at some of the initial decisions that they made that enabled DoorDash to scale, which is really sort of the question of module 5. Should we ever kick any partners off of our platform for quality reasons? Should we try and gate them on the way in? Should we let it ride and sort of see what the user feedback is, and allow the user feedback to self-select which partners are successful and which are not? And he talks in particular about the the experience of landing a big partner in Taco Bell, and the opportunities that created to attract new partners and to be more focused with the choice of partners that they would onboard at DoorDash. So I'm sort of talking you through some of the elements that we've included in the course through the 8 weeks. There's a whole host of guest lectures, but I think it's also fair to say there's a set of activities that take place in the course. So this structure is intended to keep you active. We're very conscious of the fact that everybody has 12 different tabs open. Everybody who's participating in this course has an existing day job, and trying to sort of fit in around that. The exposure of the course is also an opportunity for you guys to share with each other. So, in module 6, one of the polls that we have in the course is actually designed for you guys to share your experience with others. And, historically speaking, in my teaching career at MIT, one of the things that I've learned is, there's probably about 50% of the material that you're going to learn from the instructors, right, from the content that's developed. But then there's an additional 50% to be learned from each other. And just like the design of a two-sided market, we have structured this course to try and enable you guys to find each other in this course. So there's a very rich set of polls that we ask, which don't have a right answer, but which offer you guys an opportunity to express, here's what's worked or not worked in my experience. There's a set of discussion forums that are actively curated in the course, as well as a couple of other opportunities to get you guys to know each other in such a way that you can share your experiences. And so that comes up heavily in module 6 here. Module 7, Ollie, you gave a quick preview earlier. Could you speak a little bit about the Google case that we've included here as well?
Absolutely, and actually this might be the area where there's the strongest connection with the underlying theory of two-sided markets that has been worked out in the field of economics. In fact, there was a Nobel Prize awarded to an economist called Jean Tirole from France for his work in two-sided markets. So we don't get too heavily into the underlying economics theory here, but the basic idea is that what makes two-sided markets special is that there are cross-side effects. So growing the number of users or growing the number of providers depends on how many other providers or how many other users there are, but also how many people have joined on the other side of the market, including what the pricing structure and the segmentation is. And so we do expose you to this theory with some examples as well. We talk about the Google Ara case, which was not successful as a platform, but still very interesting in terms of a modular digitally enabled platform. And fundamentally, the question is, as you're growing the platform, what is the ultimate fate of that platform? That's what platform dynamics is. Does the platform grow? And it can't grow infinitely, right? Because we are a finite planet. We're a finite number of customers in different countries on different continents. So eventually you will experience saturation. Do you reach an equilibrium? Are there multiple equilibria, like a small or larger equilibrium that you could meet? Or you launch your platform, and after an initial period of success, eventually the platform does decay and collapse in on itself. That's what we mean by platform dynamics. And there's some underlying forces that drive these dynamics. And so this is really where the research is going, but the research also informs practical decisions and expectations that can be levied on these platforms and on these digital ecosystems. Is that helpful?
one of the, from a saturation perspective, I think this was a big question for Facebook going back 7 or 8 years, right? People said, what's the rate at which Facebook is adding new users, and does that suggest that there's limits to growth for Facebook? They ended up finding a whole series of other adjacencies, but that's a question that a lot of businesses face. Netflix right now is facing that exact same question, right? Subscriber growth rate at Netflix has really started to tail off. So we think that these are questions that are important to ask, and there's some very strong research to sort of shed light on what to expect. If nothing else, what are the modes by which platforms behave over time? And then there's a recap, as I mentioned. So I think it's worth saying, just to sort of cross-cut through the course, there's a variety of different experiences we're looking to give you guys. So there's a set of videos, obviously, in this course. One of the things that we've learned at MIT over the years is that YouTube has really changed for all of us how we watch videos. YouTube, another two-sided market that's been incredibly successful in bringing content generation forward and sustaining, positive feedback loops. One of the things that we have learned from that experience is that, busy professionals, you guys are not interested to sort of dial in live and watch a 2-hour lecture every week with us at MIT. So this whole course is organized asynchronously. Here we are synchronous, we all dialed in at the same time. This whole course is designed to sort of meet you where you are, meaning we pre-record all of the videos. And furthermore, we deliberately structure them in sort of roughly 4 to 6 minute lengths. And the intent behind that is this is not TV watching, right? Real learning takes place when you try these concepts on. And so the way that we've set the course up, there are certainly a series of videos in here. There's a whole bunch that we produce for you. But then after every one, we're asking you a poll. We're asking you to react to something. We have a series of challenge questions to test your understanding. There's a case study. And then we come back around to a video, such that there's sort of a diversity of experiences as you go through. And that's intended to sort of keep you engaged as we're going through this. I mentioned when we were talking through the modules, several of the guest speakers that we were privileged to have participated in the course, BlaBlaCar, Etsy, LinkedIn, Uber Eats, etc. I think the reality of this idea is there's a rich set of companies that are going after this, and if we can't learn from them, we're sort of trying to work this with one arm tied behind our back. So we're very much interested to look at sort of what's going on in the market today, which of these companies have been successful, which ones have not, and then try and do some pattern matching based on that. And we've grabbed a set here that are representative of successful companies. We also look at a couple of case studies of companies that were not successful in launching their own two-sided markets in this course. So we're trying to sort of balance the, in some sense, the theory and the practice as we go through this. Anybody who tells you that they have this all figured out from an industry platform's perspective is lying, right? This, the reason that there's so much investment interest in this is because there's risk associated. And, the statistics from a research standpoint tell you that. The recent Nobel Prize that Professor Dweck mentioned tells you that. This is very much a new landscape for competition. And we're going to present what we know, and we're also going to sort of make very clear what are the areas that people are still working on trying to figure out. Separate from the sort of the videos, the interviews, etc., there's a series of written content. One of the things that we're very cognizant of is sort of the majority of the people taking this course are professionals, and most of us can actually read faster than we can watch. And so there's a time efficiency question here about which cases and frameworks do we want to be written versus done on video. And in a lot of the the content, we're trying to sort of balance your time so that you get the most out of this. Ollie, I wondered if you might want to talk a little bit about this particular case study that shows up in Module 7.
Absolutely. So some of the many of the digital platforms and ecosystems that we've discussed, we are discussing in the course, are transactional, meaning that the digital platform is there to bring together a service provider like an Uber driver with a passenger that needs transport. But there's a very interesting also emergence of digital platforms that are based on physical products. And some of these physical products can be modular. The Ara case is a very interesting example of a Google project that happened about 5 years ago that I was involved in, developing a modular smartphone, essentially. And you can see it here in this picture. And I think, Bruce, if we click here just a couple times, the novelty here is that there is a two-sided market. On the right side, you see developers, potential developers that become adopters of this platform and that would provide physical modules to this phone. Physical modules could include cameras, other sensors, batteries, processors, even medical devices. So for example, if you have a condition like diabetes, you'd like to use a medical module. And the idea that Google would own the backbone, the skeleton, the modular operating system, in this case, the Android, and basically cultivate an ecosystem of module providers that would provide these physical modules conforming to the interface standard of the Ara platform. On the left side, we see potential users that would buy this phone. But unlike a standard smartphone, the configuration of this smartphone could change over time. So you could upgrade your processor. You could gift modules to family members who also have modular phones, and essentially make suggestions for how the capabilities would evolve. The stable thing, though, is the physical platform enabled by the digital platform. And then, of course, the big question, which comes up in all of the digital ecosystems and platforms, is how do you monetize? How do you monetize the platform? Do you do it on a per transaction basis? Is there a subscription or membership fee, and so forth? So it's a very rich case study. We've published on it, and we will share that in Module 7. And so you can see here the two-sidedness quite clear. Do you want me to talk about the exercises as well, Bruce? Maybe on the next chart. We believe that engaging you is important, and so you will find in all of the modules a mix of different ways of getting you engaged through polls, through challenge questions. All of the challenge questions will have immediate answers, so you will know what is the right answer, what is the wrong answer. But for some of them, especially on the learning platform, there may be not a single right answer. And so exchanging with each other the different ways to answer the challenge question will also enrich you and make you learn from the other participants in the course. And so we found that this mix of polls, forums, and challenge questions is really a great way to absorb the content and learn together as a community.
So then the last big ingredient for the course, which we previewed, is a project. So at the end of every week, there's a sort of larger, more integrative project where we're asking you to either reflect on a past case study or actually build a forward-going business. So for those of you that are interested in this course because you're either looking to create a startup or you're in an existing firm that's looking at the idea of creating a two-sided market, the project can become essentially a scaffold for you to try that out. And we'll sort of walk you through how to set the vision, and you'll have an opportunity to sort of build your vision and get some feedback from the learning facilitator on your vision, and then describe your architecture and get some feedback on your chosen architecture. as we sort of, as we progress through the course, you can sort of progress your idea as well. Now it's, we calibrate each of the weeks relative to the project, so they don't all build on each other. And that's designed in some sense to give you guys a fire break between different weeks. But what we found is that the projects are some of the most fun that you're going to have in the course, because it's your opportunity to try and apply this and then to get some feedback on it. So that being said, that's our view of this world. I see many of you have had questions in the chat. We will endeavor to answer as many of them as we can get to. I'm very appreciative of you guys spending some time with us, and we're hopeful that some of you will join us for the pilot of this course launching towards the end of the month here. So I see some hands up. Nick, I see your hand up. How are you doing, sir?
Hey, Dr. Cameron, Professor Dweck. I had the pleasure of taking Designing Product Families last year. And so without being paid a dime a commission, I can say that you two are the real deal. It was a great course. And I still refer back to it quite frequently. I am curious to know if this course you're previewing today is distinct enough from Designing Product Families, and hopefully that's not too selfish of a question. There might be others on the call who were in that one as well. And yeah, just to kind of distinguish the two and how much of this is novel. Thank you very much.
I'm happy to take that one if that's okay. So we think it's quite different. Obviously, there's some shared ideas and concepts, like the idea of a platform, the idea of a complex market with different users that don't have uniform but have differentiated needs, right, by market segment. So there are some common themes, but the big difference is that this course is about the digital world. It's about what the digital world has enabled in terms of bringing together providers and users from very, very different different parts of the market, different parts of the world. And like Bruce said earlier, the scary proposition that as a platform owner, as somebody who creates the two-sided market, you have to open yourself up to both sides, to both the provider and the user side. Whereas in the physical product world, which Nick, the course that you took, it's kind of only one-sided open, because the owner of the physical platform product chooses their suppliers, integrates their contributions, their modules in the physical product, and then sells it on the market. So it's just really a one-sided market. Those are the big differences. And so we think it's substantially different going from physical or firm-based, supply chain-based platforms to the digitally enabled, open, two-sided platforms.
So I see some other questions here in the chat. So I see one from Himansu asking, what time are the guest lectures? So this is a relevant point. The whole course is organized asynchronously, meaning we are not meeting live at a set time per week, just as we are meeting here at 6 p.m. in Europe and noon on the East Coast and 9 a.m. on the West Coast, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, middle of the night in Singapore. The whole course is designed to allow you to sort of do it at your own pace. Now we start and close the course at fixed dates, such that you guys have a cohort of people that you're working through it with. But within each of the weeks, you want to work Wednesday nights after the kids go to bed, that's fine. Your boss gives you time Friday morning for 4 hours to go through the course content, so much the better for you. There's no fixed time allocation. We do typically run 1 to 2 faculty webinars through the course, which are live. They are typically recorded if you can't make them live, but that's really the only live content. And this is sort of a trade-off that we make in this sort of new world. We're trading off flexibility versus the live delivery. But then the way that we've structured this, there's a big team behind the scenes here that's working to make sure that you guys get all of your questions answered, that you feel supported, that you have opportunities to get feedback on the content, etc. We're trying to give you the best of both worlds in that, but we're not dialing in live. I see some other questions down through the discussion forum. Is the program covering different industries such as banking and payments, providing financial services, PayPal, Stripe, etc.? Specifically, do we have a Stripe case study? No. Are banking and payments as a potential two-sided market in scope for the course? Absolutely, yes. That's one of the sort of fun things of these two-sided markets is there, these transaction platforms span a bunch of different areas of industry, banking being one of them. I think it's easy to sort of classify this all as tech, but when you start to sort of unearth that, transportation is arguably the business that Uber and Uber Eats are in versus the service industry versus banking. That opening slide I showed on, how are LinkedIn and Salesforce similar? That's the fun of this course, is that these business models actually have quite a relationship to each other. And we're trying to compare, many different ones to try and extract out the patterns. I see Jayesh, nice to see you here. I see your hand up. What's your question, sir?
Thank you, Dr. Cameron. So thank you, Dr. Cameron and Professor Oliver. Actually, I attended the past product designing family, and it was wonderful and enriching experience. So on this course, actually, I have one question. So this is more focusing two-side market and platform, also more considering the human aspect and people to people, right? So I think this industrial IoT, more of the machine to machine or device to device, that is also another two-sided market, right? Because in future, like 10, 15 years down the line, machines are talking more than people actually, and they are contributing more than people probably in terms of data also, right? Like sunset in the evening, temperature, my thermostat will be activated by Alexa, will turn on the light in the evening and set the mood or something, right? So that is all like, I think, industrial IoT platform where GE Predix tried one thing, and unfortunately, I think it didn't work that well. We are still, of course, kind of big in the Siemens with the MindSphere industrial IoT, but we were like 2-3 years ago, we were saying that it's an industrial IoT platform. But now we no longer say that it's an industrial IoT platform, right? I mean, it is still the world leader in terms of industrial IoT, but it's not a platform. So I think, can you please, add in that into either course or somewhere where you focus on to that industrial IoT platform, which can in future become like a Uber of the devices, or Uber of the IoT, all these small devices and large devices as well.
Well, so there's a number of places I feel like where these kind of battles are being fought. Smart home is one of them. As another example of, we have all of these IoT devices in the home. Wouldn't it be great if we could be the intermediary layer between those consumers and the host businesses? I think the way that we would see this in the course is two-sided markets don't have to have consumers as the second side, right? These can be B2B markets in much the same way that, Salesforce is busy trying to start an app exchange. Right. And these are businesses joining Salesforce as partners who are selling to Salesforce customers who are other businesses. So do we talk, do we talk about sort of the B2B side as well as the B2C? Yes. The vast majority of the work in this tends to be B2C just because that's a huge market. For people to go after, from an investing standpoint. If you're going to invest in this, you want to see as big a market as you can. Mm-hmm. Ollie, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure. But it's a great point. In fact, in the course, we developed a 3x3 matrix. If you think about it, the most general view of this is B2C, like Bruce mentioned, C2C, but also G2C, government to consumer. And this is perhaps the most recent trend in this. Some of you have asked about trends, is that governments have begun to understand that by creating a powerful digital platform, you can get services done much more efficiently, right, as a public service than you can in the traditional way. And so it's not a central part of the course, but we do mention and provide at least a taxonomy that you can start to understand, you know, B2C, B2B, G2C. There's essentially, it's a 3x3. And in some of these cells of that taxonomy, you see, especially the B2C and C2C, most digital platforms live today. And the reason for that is because, you know, for an investment in creating this digital ecosystem, you get the most users, the most transactions, the most opportunity to monetize the platform on a per unit investment in these larger markets. But the trend absolutely is that the digital platforms are starting to penetrate, not yet maybe as much into the nonprofit world, but definitely governments are paying attention. And we at least foreshadow, I think, in the course, some of those developments.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. And maybe I will connect offline with, like, you know, Open API and other questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Please do, Jayesh.
Yeah, thank you.
Nader, what's your question? I see your hand up, Nader Martello.
Sí, mi pregunta es en español, no hablo inglés. Mi pregunta es la siguiente: estas plataformas han permitido la customización. Esta customización ha hecho que muchas plataformas, que la cadena de suministro se vea afectada, dado que antes de la existencia de estas plataformas, los puntos de entrega eran muy inferior a la cantidad que hoy día lo son. En este curso se aborda también ese desafío, cómo integrar para darle una respuesta efectiva en la entrega al cliente, en la respuesta al cliente, teniendo en cuenta que esto impacta directamente en la cadena de suministro. Muchas gracias.
I'm going to do my best to translate this. Nader, ¿puedes repetirlo otra vez, por favor? So what I
Sí, por
understood
supuesto.
Perdón, por favor. Adelante.
La customización que permiten estas plataformas han hecho que se vea afectada la cadena de suministro, dado que la cantidad de puntos de entrega se multiplicaron. Dentro del curso también se visualiza el reto para la integración de la cadena de suministro.
Okay, so for Dr. Cameron and Professor Dweck, the question is about, you know, how to integrate kind of point to point in the supply chain.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
So that's interesting. I think the reality of supply chains today is that there's so many inefficiencies from a digital perspective. You know, there are so many challenges just when you think about invoicing or when you think about sort of order fulfillment. You know, the course is not centrally about supply chain considerations. So we're not going to do any modeling of supply chains. There are lots of our colleagues at MIT who do supply chain work. You know, I think there are a number of interesting examples of firms trying to create two-sided markets in supply chains. So Ariba from SAP is one of them, right? Where they're trying to both host a series of providers and provide business to those providers, you know, source opportunities for them, as well as intermediate on the more traditional, you know, SAP type of transactions that exist. But, you know, I love to use that example because I think SAP is just one of these classic challenges moving a product to a platform. You know, SAP has a pretty poor track record of integration over time, heavy customization required, and has not done a particularly strong job of sort of opening up to new providers at scale. So that's my personal opinion about SAP, but hopefully that gives you some context for sort of how that's going to play out in the context of the course. Nader.
All right, great. I hope I did a decent job there translating, Nader. Thank you so much for your question. Gracias para tu pregunta. So we are right at the top of the hour. So unfortunately, I don't think we'll have any more time to answer any additional questions. However, I want to thank everyone so much. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Cameron and Professor DeVec for leading the session today, and thank you so much to all of our participants for all of your thoughtful questions and interactions. Just another reminder, in the chat, you'll also find a link to a survey to fill out. We're always, aiming to improve our sessions. And you can also find more information about Dr. Cameron and Professor DeVec's course as well on our website. So thank you so much to everyone. Muchas gracias a todos. Merci beaucoup. And I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Good to see you all. Bye-bye. Adios.